Danny's last name might be Barlow, but the bar is high with this prospect. Danny is a very solid up-and-coming prospect coming from Memphis, Tennessee, a rough and tough city where it's ranked as being the 10th most dangerous city in the world. He has a history in jiu-jitsu and his striking is phenomenal. The man has speed for days and solid accuracy when he throws. He fights at 170 pounds, so in other words, welterweight, and stands at a staggering 6'2", training out of law school MMA, although I would not take his legal advice. He is only 29 years old, so he is just now entering his physical prime. But before we talk too much about his skills, let's take a gander into his career this far. Mr. Barlow spent 2019 to 2021 in the amateur scene, having 6 fights and only losing 1. He lost that fight by submission after his opponent caught him in a heel hook. Barlow made his pro debut in 2021 in the AKA promotion, fighting Chris Mims. He dominated Mims, winning by decision. He would fight again in 2022 going up against Lorenzo Perez, and he would run through Perez by getting the submission victory just 3 minutes into the fight. Just a month later, Barlow would fight Jordan Fowler, and once again steamrolled his opponent by knocking him out in devastating fashion. Barlow would then get signed to the Cage Fury promotion. He would then fight Dustin DePuma. This fight wouldn't be a cakewalk, but he would still win by decision. Barlow would fight again in March of 2023 against Trevor Allison, and once again, Barlow would starch his opponent by knocking him out in the very first round. Barlow would fight again in July of 2023 when he would face off with Jarius Gill, and yet again, Danny Barlow would destroy his opponent by way of first round knockout. This knockout was big enough to gain the attention of the UFC, but they were not sold yet. So they would have Barlow fight in the very popular show, Dana White's Contender Series. Making his appearance on the show in September of 2023, his opponent would be Raheem Forrest. Many thought this fight would be tough, but they would be wrong, because just 1 minute into the first round, Barlow would knock out Forrest in spectacular fashion. The big man Dana White was shocked and signed the man before another promotion would get their dirty, rotten mitts on him. And in February of 2024 would be the big day, because he would make his UFC debut against a much more experienced fighter, Josh Quinlan. At the time, people thought Josh would be a problem in the promotion, but Barlow would steal all the hype and prove to everybody that he is here to stay. And Danny would do just that by knocking out Josh Quinlan just 1 minute into the third round, putting on a pace and showed a phenomenal striking game. And now he is fighting another good fighter, and Nikolay Veretennikov, a 12-4 fighter this weekend. Danny has an incredible 76% finishing rate with 0 losses. Personally, I think Barlow has the potential to become a top 15 fighter, given that he continues to improve and evolve as a fighter. Steve Erceg might not be the typical fighter you'd see on a potential prospect, but he has only had 14 fights, and he is currently under 30 years old. While many of you know the name, you might not know just how dominant he was, especially with the insane jump in competition. But that's enough yapping, and let's get right into the nitty gritty and break this puppy down. A young Erceg, Astro Boy himself, was born and raised in Myrie, West Australia. A nice place to live. It has great schools and it doesn't have a lot of crime, but it also isn't the safest city in Australia. Erceg is well educated and well spoken, with him attending Corpus Christi College. He was a huge WWE fan in his younger years, which got him inspired by Brock Lesnar becoming champion after being a star in the WWE. He challenged himself fighting in multiple Muay Thai events as well as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competitions, but his biggest achievement was getting the gold medal in the 65 kilogram division in Australian National Freestyle Wrestling. He is pretty tall for a flyweight, standing at 5'8". He's just now entering his physical prime, being 29 years old. A young Steve Erceg made his professional debut in February of 2016, going up against Ryan Robertson. Stevie Boy would demolish Robertson by sinking in the guillotine choke and getting the tap. Steve would take some time off and focused on improving. He would eventually fight again in September of 2017, going up against Sean Gotchi. However, this wouldn't be a walk in the park. This is where old Stevie Boy would take his first loss. He didn't get finished, however, but he would lose by unanimous decision. Fun fact about Gotchi, he has a 9-1 record and is fighting on Dana White's Contender Series in October, so definitely pay attention when that time comes. But back to the video. Steve Erceg would fight about 6 months later, in July of 2018, fighting Seung Gook Choi, and he would jump right back into the win column, winning by unanimous decision. Steve would wait a long time to fight again, eventually fighting in March of 2019, facing off with Mark Familiari, and Steve would make short work of this fella by sinking in a nasty rear naked choke just 4 minutes into the first round. After steamrolling Mark and bringing his head back to the locker room, he would fight 2 months later in May, stepping up to fight Tim Moore, and once again, Erceg would show up and show out in spectacular fashion, dominating his opponent and eventually sinking in an arm triangle choke in the third round. Having his second head on the shelf, he would fight once more in 2019 in September, this time against Paul Loga, and he would starch this Paul guy with a nasty punch to the teeth in the first minute of the first round. After 3 finishes in a row and his loss far behind him, he would fight again in March of 2020. This time his victim would be Shannon Ross. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Shannon was in the UFC and took 3 losses in a row, all of them by knockout. However, Steve Erceg would not knock out Shannon because he would sink in reliable rear naked choke. Steve Erceg would fight in June of 2021, this time fighting Cody Haddon, another fighter fighting on Dana White's Contender Series in a week, August 20th. So again, pay attention to him. But Haddon would not be a challenge for the Astro Boy because he would dominate Haddon by unanimous decision. Erceg was looking like he would eventually fight in the UFC, but he still had to make more of a name for himself. So he would get a rematch with Paul Loga, however, it would be more of the same, because Steve would sink in a guillotine choke in the first round and get the submission victory. Steve would take 2022 off and focus on his craft, slowly but surely improving his striking and his grappling. And in February of 2023, he would be the main event for the first time, when he would fight Sorichiro Hira, and yet again steamroll his opponent after sinking in a rear naked choke just 1 minute into the first round. This would catch the attention of the UFC, but they weren't sold yet. Steve would be scheduled to fight on the Dana White's Contender Series show, but due to visa issues, he wouldn't be able to attend. So they would have him fight on the Dern vs. Hill card, but yet again, he wouldn't be able to make it to America due to visa issues. But the UFC wouldn't let Astro Boy go without trying one more time. So in June of 2023, Steve Erceg would make his long-awaited UFC debut, fighting David Dvorak on the prelims of the UFC 289 pay-per-view card. Dvorak would be no challenge for Erceg because he would dominate his opponent by unanimous decision. After winning the UFC debut, he would fight again in November of 2023, this time facing off with a pretty good fighter, Alessandro Costa. This would be a harder fight, but Erceg would win all 3 rounds, winning by unanimous decision. With the flyweight division being as shallow as it is, Erceg quickly got shot into the rankings, and he would face off with a fan favorite and veteran of the sport, Matt Schnell. And Erceg would absolutely obliterate Matt, knocking him out in the second round just 26 seconds into the round. Erceg was still unknown to the majority of the UFC fans, but he would get a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The UFC would call Steve Erceg and offer him a title shot just 329 days into the promotion. His opponent would be Alexandre Pantoja. The public opinion was one-sided. People felt like Erceg was good, but he wasn't ready to challenge for the title quite yet. The odds were very much against him, but once fight day came and both warriors stepped into the octagon, Erceg would shock the fans and the media, beating Pantoja on the feet, and going into the 5th and final round, fans had it 2 rounds for Erceg and 2 rounds for Pantoja, but Erceg made a mistake that would cost him the fight. He shot for a takedown, and Pantoja would end the fight having won the 5th round. Erceg had lost, but he gained a huge fan base after showcasing that he was not a lamb for slaughter. He had much better striking, much better footwork, and he was tough as nails. And this brings us to this weekend. He is fighting Kai Kara France, a heavy-handed fighter who doesn't have great head movement or footwork, but he is tough. and if he lands clean, then your lights might get shut off. Erceg currently has 12 wins and 2 losses. He has 2 knockout wins, 6 submission wins, and 4 decision wins, while both of his losses have been by decision. Overall, I think Erceg will win by either submission in the 3rd or by decision. I think he has learned from his loss against Pantoja and will sharpen his fight IQ in the high pressure moments. Technically, I think Erceg is much better on the feet than Kai. Today, on Potential Prospect, we will be looking into the Fighting Nerd's top prospect, and seemingly the captain of the gym, Caio Borralho. It goes without saying that Caio is a prospect, and he is a problem in the middleweight division. But we still have questions, and a lot of people aren't aware of the nitty-gritty when it comes to him, and that is what this video will go over. Caio Borralho is 31 years old and stands at 6 feet 2 inches tall. He was born and raised in São Luís, Brazil, a beautiful place also known as the Island of Love, and is known for its bars and pubs that host live reggae nights, gaining the nickname the capital of reggae. Borralho is a very intelligent man, taking inspiration from his grandfather, who was a teacher, leading a 15-year-old Caio to become a tutor in math and chemistry. Once he graduated from high school, he would go off to UFMA and study industrial chemistry. He was eventually offered an internship at a popular Brazilian brewery called Giant Imavov. During all of this, Caio would train multiple martial arts, starting in judo. He would win multiple championships in judo at the state and national levels. He would eventually lose to an opponent getting caught in an arm lock. This would make him move into jiu-jitsu to work on his submissions and enrich his judo skills. Teammates would inspire Borralho to try out Muay Thai, and he would naturally want to combine his respected disciplines and try them out in the growing sport of MMA. In 2014, a 21-year-old Borralho would make his amateur debut and beat his opponent in impressive fashion, winning by TKO just 2 minutes into the first round. After achieving his first victory in MMA, he would transition to a professional fight. In December of 2014, he would make the walk in his very first fight. He was matched up with Clayton Rafael. Borralho would once again show up and show out in spectacular fashion, knocking Rafael out cold in the first minute of the fight. The crowd and coaches went crazy, so Borralho took a few months off to recover from his previous training camp. He would fight again 4 months later in July of 2015, going up against João Carvalho. Carvalho was an undefeated 4-0 fighter, and this would be a big test for Borralho. It turned out to be a tough fight, and he would fall short of beating Carvalho. This was rough, but Borralho felt a sense of relief knowing he didn't have to protect his undefeated record, as well as not chasing the finish. He would fight again in September of 2016, stepping up to face Edson Jr. Borralho would showcase his improved fight IQ and his grappling by choking out Edson in the 3rd round. He would take another year off and fight again in September of 2017, this time fighting Luis Carlos Alves. He would end up being no match for Borralho because he would starch Alves just 20 seconds into the 1st round. Borralho had finally gotten some momentum, winning 2 fights in a row and finishing both opponents. He would take a few months off, fighting again in 2018, facing off with Raylander Marquez. This would not go as planned because in the 1st round, the fight would get chalked down as a no contest. This was another bump in the road, but it also wasn't a loss, so he was still very confident in himself. Borralho would start to be much more active, having 4 fights in the next 15 months, finishing 3 of them. He ended up getting 2 submissions in the 1st round as well as a knockout in the 1st round. Borralho would take some time off to recover from his busy schedule, fighting again in October of 2020, going up against Wildemar Souza. This would be his 3rd fight to go the distance. Borralho was gaining hype and local fans at a crazy pace, and the UFC would hear whispers about this insane fighter on the regional scene. Once they took a gander at his record and how many 1st-round finishes he had, they had no other option than to give him a shot in the big leagues. But they weren't 100% sold on him yet. They would have him fight on a very popular show, Dana White's Contender Series. He would fight Aaron Jeffrey. Borralho would dominate Jeffrey, but his opponent was tough and hard to finish. However, Borralho would still get the unanimous decision win. This wasn't quite enough for the big man to sign him immediately, so Dana would have him fight again 3 weeks later. His opponent this time was Jesse Murray. Borralho was fired up and ready to make a statement to the red-faced head honcho. In just 1 minute into the first round, Borralho would land a few hard shots to the chops and force the ref to step in. This performance was more than enough to get him signed to the biggest promotion in the world. And in April of 2022, he would make his long-awaited UFC debut against Godsey Omargadzhiev. This would be a tough fight, but Borralho was still winning the exchanges. And just 3 minutes into the last round, he would land an illegal knee, and the ref had the doctor step in to see if his opponent could continue. But Godsey did not want to, leaving it up to the judges to see if Borralho or his opponent would win the decision. And it turned out, Borralho did more than enough to get the nod. After the blunder in his debut, and his win streak still intact, Borralho would move forward, fighting again in July of that same year, this time fighting Armen Petrosian. This would be a tough fight, but not tough enough to beat Borralho, because he would still end up getting yet another unanimous decision win. He was on a good roll in the UFC, so they would match him up with another pretty good fighter, Mahmoud Muradov, in October of 2022. This was another fight that wasn't a walk in the park, but Borralho was still dominating his opponent, beating him by unanimous decision once again. Borralho was gaining momentum and building a fan base faster than most. Winning his first 3 fights in less than a year, he would get a jump up in competition, and in April of 2023, he would be fighting a Polish fan favorite that has been gaining fans of his own, Michael Olenjacek. This was a very tough fight, but Borralho would showcase his fight IQ as well as his well-rounded skill set by beating Michael in the first round and sinking in a very tight rear naked choke just 2 minutes into the second round. Borralho was ecstatic after getting his first official finish in the promotion, and he would be chomping at the bit to get another fight. Just a few months later, he would get that shot against a fighter with a ton of potential, Abus Magomedov. This would be a very tough fight. Abus is a very good fighter on the feet and is a real danger to try to outstrike due to his Muay Thai style. But Borralho was much more well-rounded in his game, and this fight would show that. He would eventually get Abus against the cage and down on the ground time and time again, leading to a very dominant unanimous decision win for Borralho. He was gaining fans all around the world, but we still hadn't seen him do much striking. Sure, he has good technique and good defense, but how would he fare against a guy who was better at grappling? Needless to say, there were many questions the fans still had, and in May of this year, he would get a matchup that would answer that question, this matchup being Paul Craig. Borralho would go into the fight extremely confident, and he also had a lot of expectations. And Borralho would meet those expectations with flying colors by knocking Paul Craig out cold in the second round only 2 minutes in. And this brings us to this weekend. Cal Borralho is set to face by far his toughest matchup to date, the Killer Gorilla, Jared Cannonier. This is an insane matchup that will answer even more questions we have. Those questions being, how good is his chin? How will he deal with a much more experienced fighter who is also very hard to finish? And will we find out how good Borralho's striking really is? Cal Borralho has a record of 16 wins with only 1 loss and 1 no contest. He has 5 knockout wins, 4 submission wins, and 7 decision wins, with his only loss being by way of decision. And remember, that was only his second professional fight. He is currently 6-0 in the UFC with 2 finishes. Overall, I'm leaning toward Borralho to get the win over Jared, because he has a much better fight IQ as well as a better grappling. Therefore, Borralho has more ways to win, whether it be by decision or submission. I do think Jared's only real path to victory is to land clean, hard shots early on in the fight, as well as mixing in the body shots with the head shots, and try to drain the gas tank of Borralho. I'm very excited for this fight, and if you've seen Borralho fight, you probably are as well. Today on Potential Prospect, we will be breaking down the career and journey of Vanessa Demopoulos.
Congratulations. all your hard work. Ladies.
Vanessa was born September 22nd, 1988 in Cleveland, Ohio. She was raised in Ohio with her parents, but spent a few years living in Greece with her grandparents. Eventually, Vanessa would make some bad decisions and end up getting kicked out of multiple schools for getting into fights, leading to her drug use, becoming homeless in her teenage years, and eventually following some family footsteps and becoming an exotic dancer once she turned 18. Like and subscribe. It's no secret that being an exotic dancer can be dangerous. When she turned 21 years old, she would join an MMA gym to better learn how to defend herself. At 24 years old, she started training and would start her MMA journey in the amateurs. She would have 7 fights, having 6 wins with only 1 loss. In December of 2017, she would make her professional debut facing off with Emmy Weber. This would be a walk in the park for Vanessa because she would sink in a tight armbar just 4 minutes into the first round. Her next fight would be almost a year later in October of 2018. This time her opponent would be Itzel Equevel. This would be a harder night in the office than Vanessa had expected. She ended up losing by unanimous decision. After getting her first loss, she would regroup and sharpen her tools, as well as work on her fight IQ, especially when she finds herself in bad situations. She would fight again 5 months later in March of 2019. This time, she would fight Valerie Anne-Marie Soto. This would be a hard fight and would test Vanessa once again, but she was better prepared for these situations, leaving the fight up for the judges to decide the winner. Vanessa had done enough to get her hand raised, leaving the arena with all of the judges thinking she had won. After getting back in the win column, Vanessa would fight again in June of that same year. This time, her opponent would be Nadine Bendayo. Vanessa would show up and show out in spectacular fashion by sinking in another very tight armbar and forcing the tap just 2 minutes into the first round. After getting back-to-back wins, Vanessa would take the rest of the year off and further improve her game. She would fight in January of 2020. Her opponent was supposed to be Flore Hani, but her opponent would back out and a new opponent would step in, Loveth Young. This would turn out to be another tough matchup, but Vanessa was no stranger to hard fights. Once again, she would win by unanimous decision. Not only had she won her fight, but she got a 3-fight win streak going. It was starting to look like she would leave the exotic dancing scene and become a UFC fighter as long as she stayed on the straight and narrow, not wanting to lose her momentum. Vanessa would fight again in July of that same year, and the LFA would finally get her a title shot against a strawweight champion, Sam Hughes, who is now in the UFC as well. This would be a back and forth scrap, but only one person can leave the octagon the champion. And in the 4th round, Vanessa would sink in an inverted triangle choke and force Hughes to tap. Vanessa had finally achieved her dream of becoming a champion. After getting her belt, the UFC would take notice of this attractive and charismatic WMMA fighter and give her a shot on Dana White's Contender Series. Her opponent would turn out to be Corey McKenna, and in August of 2020, barely a month later, after her last fight, she would attempt to get the UFC contract. Unfortunately, this would be a harder fight than she had expected because she would end up getting outclassed by McKenna, losing to her by unanimous decision. After falling short of her dreams, she was still motivated to get into the promotion. After all, she still had her belt in the LFA, so Vanessa would attempt to defend her title in October of 2020. Her opponent would be another popular fighter that hadn't been signed yet, Lupita Godinez. Vanessa would walk into this fight with a point to prove, and she would also headline the event for the 2nd time in her short career. But if you've seen Lupi fight, then you know she is a very legit, very tough fighter, and Vanessa would once again fall short in this fight, getting outclassed and beaten once again by decision. Vanessa had lost 2 fights in a row, and things were looking bleak, but Vanessa has had a tough road even before her MMA journey, and she was far from giving up on herself. Vanessa would focus now more than ever to improve her game and learn how to box more technically. 6 months later, in March of 2021, Vanessa would make the well-known walk again, this time fighting Cynthia Arceo. With a fire lit under her and even more of a point to prove, Vanessa would walk into that octagon and put on a show. She would knock out Cynthia in just 37 seconds into the first round, her fastest finish to date. Not only did Vanessa shock herself, but she would shock the fans and even the UFC, so much so that they would offer Vanessa a contract in the biggest promotion in the world, the UFC. Vanessa had finally done it. She is now on the big stage, not only in the nightclubs, but in the sport she had come to love. So in August of 2021, she would make her UFC debut, almost exactly a year after her Contender Series loss. Her opponent would end up being a very good fighter, JJ Aldrich. This would be a back and forth scrap with both women being tested, but at the end of the day, only one fighter can leave the winner, and Vanessa would walk out the loser of that fight. Vanessa was still confident because JJ was a very experienced fighter with a ton of hype, so her stock didn't drop much. In the meantime, while she waited for another fight, she would do 2 grappling matches. She would beat Brittany Way by decision and lose to Fatima Klein by armbar. After getting her name out there a little bit more to the hardcore MMA fans, she would fight again in January of 2022, this time fighting Silvana Juarez. This was far from a competitive fight because just 2 minutes into the first round, Vanessa would sink in another armbar and get the tap. While the fight alone didn't get a ton of new eyes on her, her post-fight interview did, jumping into the arms of Joe Rogan and screaming,
Congratulations. All your hard work. Ladies and
"Oh my god, it's Joe Rogan," into the mic. She would go viral, and this would gain her a giant jump in fans with eyes on her career. With fans making jokes about Joe Rogan's wife getting jealous when Vanessa jumped into his arms. Vanessa would do another grappling competition and still made it on ESPN's MMA page, proving that she already had potential to become a star. And in June of 2022, she would have another fight. This time, her opponent would be Junyu Frey. This was a back and forth scrap with both fighters being tested. It was a razor close fight and would get left to the judges to decide the winner, and the judges would award Vanessa the split decision win. Some say Junyu Frey got robbed, but when a fight is that close, it is hard to call it a robbery. It could have easily been given to the other fighter as well. After getting the split decision victory, Vanessa would fight again in November of that same year, this time fighting Maria Oliveira. This would turn out to be another tough fight, but Vanessa was winning the grappling and striking exchanges, leading to a dominant unanimous decision win over Oliveira. Vanessa would take 6 months off to further improve her game and enjoy the fruits of her labor, and in May of 2023, Vanessa would fight Karolina Kowalkiewicz. Vanessa would miss weight for the first time in her career, coming in at 117.5 pounds, 1.5 pounds over the weight limit. Unfortunately, losing to the scales wouldn't be the only loss she took, because she would lose by Karolina by unanimous decision. After the rough showing, Vanessa would take off another 6 months to learn how to cut weight and diet properly to avoid this blunder in the future, eventually fighting again in October of that same year. This time her opponent would be Kaneko Murata. This would be another dominant fight for Vanessa that left nobody with any questions who won by the end of the fight, getting the nod from the fans and the judges. Vanessa would make her most recent showing in May of this year. Her opponent would be Emily Ducote. This would be another razor close fight that tested both fighters and left them both battered and bruised. But again, only one can leave the octagon a winner, and Vanessa turned out to get the nod and win the razor close split decision. And again, some fans felt like she lost this fight, but to harp on what I said previously, you can't call a close fight a robbery. And that brings us to this weekend. Vanessa Demopoulos is set to fight Jacqueline Amarim. Vanessa currently has a record of 11 wins and 5 losses. She is 35 years old and stands at 5 feet and 2 inches tall. She has 1 knockout win, 4 submission wins, and 6 decision wins, with all 5 of her losses being by decision, so she has never been finished in her career. Overall, this will be a hard fight for Vanessa, with Jacqueline being an 8-1 fighter, but Vanessa has more experience and has less damage on her body than most women her age, with Vanessa starting her MMA journey at 24 years old. And Jacqueline's only loss has been to Sam Hughes, who Vanessa dominated, which is making me lean towards Vanessa in this matchup, but this is the sport of MMA and the math doesn't always add up. Riddle me this, dear viewer. What do Evander Holyfield and Andre Lima have in common? You got your answer? They have been bitten out of frustration by their opponents. Like and subscribe. Andre Lima is a Brazilian-born, hardworking fighter who is no stranger to combat sports. Lima was born February 4th, 1999, which makes him 25 years old. He has a background of kickboxing starting in 2009, winning multiple youth kickboxing titles in Brazil. Wanting to switch it up and level up his skill in martial arts, Lima would start training in mixed martial arts. In 2015, training at Team Lucas Mineiro, as well as being part of the Mascote team. Eventually, Lima would have 3 amateur fights, having his first fight in 2015 and his last fight being in 2020. He won 2 of those fights by submission and lost his last amateur fight by decision. After that loss, Lima would sharpen his tools and learn how to better incorporate his kickboxing skill into the sport of MMA without leaving himself vulnerable to takedowns. And in October of 2022, he had improved enough to join a professional promotion, Spartacus MMA, facing off with Joao Oliveira. This would turn out to be a walk in the park because Lima would pick Oliveira apart and land clean, hard shots to the body, leading to a knockout due to a punch to the liver. Just 1 minute and 55 seconds into the first round, Lima was ecstatic and ready to fight again, and he would get that opportunity just 1 month later in November of that same year, this time fighting Luis Martins. Once again, Lima would make short work of his opponent by getting the TKO finish just 1 minute into the first round. Lima was ready for his next fight the second this one was over, leading to him fighting again just 1 month later in December of 2022, facing off with Victor Santos. This wouldn't be a finish, however, but he would still dominate his opponent, eventually leading to a unanimous decision win. Lima would fight again in February of 2023, fighting Nathan Zelle. Once again, he would be the superior fighter, beating Zelle just 3 minutes into the first round. 2 months later, in May of that same year, he would face off with Alexandre Rodriguez, with this time fighting in a different promotion called R1 Fighting Series. This would turn out to be the easiest fight to date because in July of 2023, Lima would fight Igor Talin. This wouldn't be as easy as his previous fight, but he would still get the knockout with a clean, vicious elbows. This would catch the attention of the biggest Bellator, just kidding, the UFC. They wouldn't be 100% sold on him yet, so they would give him a shot on a popular show, Dana White's Contender Series, in October of 2023. He would fight Hickson Zanid for the UFC contract. This would be a back and forth scrap with Lima winning most of the exchanges. Eventually, the fight would be left to the judges to pick the winner, and it was Andre Lima. Most of the time, Dana doesn't sign fighters who win by decision, but Lima had done so well in this fight, as well as his insane record for only being in the sport for 1 year and 2 days. So the big man, Dana White, would give him a shot in the UFC. Lima was excited. In just 1 year, he went from making his professional debut to having a UFC contract with a great record of 7-0, with 5 of those fights being finishes, and none of his finishes seeing the third round. So in March of 2024, Lima would face off with an 8-0 record, Igor Severino. This would be a fantastic, with the first round being very even, and in the second round, Lima was pulling away with it and started to get the better of Igor, and then the unthinkable happened. Igor bit Lima so bad that it was bleeding, and you could see teeth marks clear as day on his bicep, leading to Igor not only being disqualified and Lima winning the fight, but Igor would get cut immediately after his debut. This turned out to be great for Lima. Not only did he win his debut, but he got a $50K bonus, and he got his name out there with everyone either watching the clip on ESPN or by people showing their friends that don't normally watch the sport. Lima still wanted to be active and wanted to get a legitimate win that wasn't tainted in controversy. So in June of this year, he would face off with another up-and-coming fighter with only 1 loss and 9 wins, Mitch Raposo. People wrote Mitch off because of his short stature and not only fighting a well-known name and not fighting any well-known names. This turned out to be wrong because this would be a crazy scrap with both men being tested, but Lima ended up doing just enough to get the judges to award him the win. However, this would be controversial because many people felt like Mitch did more. And that brings us to this weekend. Andre Lima is fighting yet another up-and-comer with a great record, Felipe Dos Santos. Felipe has a record of 8 wins with only 1 loss. If you add up Lima's opponents' records in the UFC, it would be 25 wins with only 2 losses, which is pretty crazy. Andre Lima has a record of 9 wins with 0 losses. He has won 5 fights by knockout and 3 decision wins, as well as the disqualification win in his UFC debut. Overall, I'm picking Andre Lima to win by decision, but I do think this is a fight you will not want to miss. Today on Potential Prospect, we are looking into the early life and current career of Michael Morales. Michael was born in a beautiful city that sits on top of a mountain in Ecuador. This city has old-fashioned cobblestone streets, and you can visit many old gold mines. He stands at 6 feet tall, fights at welterweight, and is currently only 25 years old. So let's stop the yapping and get right into it. A young Michael Morales was born in 1999 and started training in the respectable discipline of judo at just 5 years old. At the age of just 10 years old, Michael would switch from judo to wrestling. He would end up winning several youth tournaments, and at the age of 14, his father would bring Michael to Victor Vallejo's academy in Machala, where he would begin to train mixed martial arts. While a young Michael would train MMA, he would juggle a blue-collar job building ships at a naval boat factory. In August of 2018, Michael would make his professional debut in OFC, skipping the amateur scene altogether. In his debut, he would face off with Alvaro. This would go swimmingly for Michael because he would end up knocking out his opponent 3 minutes into the second round. After having his debut go as great as it did, he would fight again in March of 2018, where he would face off with Vacasella once again, this time beating him in the first round due to a doctor stoppage. Michael was looking like a top prospect, but he still needed to get many more fights under his belt. So he would do just that and fight again in December of that same year, this time getting a fresh face in Leonardo Blasco for Michael, but he would still get the win, this time by decision. Michael would keep the momentum going and sign to fight Oscar Ravello in July of 2019. Michael would beat Oscar so badly that his corner would throw in the towel and beg for the fight to be stopped, getting Michael the win in the second round. Naturally, he would want to keep this momentum going, so he would waste no time and fight again in September of that same year, this time fighting Mateus Salazar. This would be the first time he was a main event. Michael would not let this opportunity go to waste and steamroll his opponent, knocking him out just 1 minute into the first round. He would fight 2 months later, in November, headlining the card once again. This time his opponent would be Eric Zambrano. This fight would go just as well as his previous one, knocking out Zambrano just 1 minute and 55 seconds into the first round. After achieving back-to-back 1 minute knockouts, he would fight 1 month later in December, this time fighting Gregory Cisneros. This fight would be just as much of a cakewalk as his last two. He would switch it up and sink in a devastating triangle choke and get the tap just 1 minute into the first round. Michael was on cloud 9 after getting 3 first-round finishes in the last 4 months. And 2 months later, in February of 2020, Michael would fight Mario Navarte. This wouldn't be as easy of a matchup, but he would still get the finish in the second round. Michael was making a name for himself quickly, and his UFC dreams were slowly becoming a reality, especially considering he was only 21 years old. Michael would slow his roll, but he would fight again in August of that same year, this time fighting Danny Uguay Bastidas. He would beat his opponent from pillar to post, getting the doctor stoppage win in the first 2 minutes of the first round. Michael would fight again 2 months later in October of 2020, this time facing off with Ricardo Seneto, headlining the card for the third time in his career. And once again, he would get a first round knockout. Michael was very good and had limitless potential, but he still needed to sharpen his tools and get better training partners. In 2021, he would begin his journey traveling through Tijuana, Mexico, eventually finding himself at Interim Gym. This is where he would be able to make a name for himself and get his name out there to some of the biggest promotions in the sport. And in April of 2021, he would fight in a Mexican promotion called UWC, this time fighting Miguel Azamenti. This fight would go just as his previous fights would go, just not as quickly, but Michael would still get the knockout in the second round. The UFC was noticing this 22-year-old fighter with an amazing 11-0 record, as well as a majority of his fights not seeing the second round. They saw a potential star and would want to give him an invite to a very popular show, Dana White's Contender Series, to see if he was a legit fighter or just another hype train beating cans on the regional scene. And in September of 2021, he would make his appearance on the show, fighting Nikolay Veretennikov. This would be a back and forth scrap with both fighters showing their best, but one man showed more to the judges and ended up getting the nod from the judges. That man was Michael Morales. Dana was blown away at the skill, toughness, and fight IQ of a 22-year-old fighter, and he proved that Michael was indeed the real deal. So the UFC would get him on a card as fast as they could, and that would be in January of 2022 fighting Trevin Giles. Most would be nervous in their debut and wouldn't perform at their best, but Michael is built different. He would destroy Giles, knocking him out 4 minutes into the first round. Michael would waste no time in fighting again in July of 2022, this time fighting another very good fighter, Adam Fugit. This would be a very hard fight that tested both men, but once again, Michael would come out on top, knocking out Fugit just 1 minute into the third round. Michael would take some time off to enjoy the fruits of his labor, taking 11 months off, fighting again in July of 2023, going up against a very tough veteran, Max Payne Griffin. This would turn out to be a back and forth scrap with both men being tested, but Michael was not new to hard fights, and it was evident due to him winning the exchanges, eventually leading to a unanimous decision win for the young prodigy. Michael was on an amazing pace to get into the rankings, but he still needed to build even more of a fan base and prove his worth to the big man, Dana White. So the UFC would match him up with another fighter who got into the UFC at a very young age, Jake Matthews. They would fight in November of 2023, and it would live up to the expectation. It was a back and forth war, but only one person can win, and that man was Michael Morales. And that brings us to this weekend. Michael Morales is going to be fighting the best gatekeeper the promotion has to offer, Neil Magny. If Michael can get past Magny, then he deserves to be in the rankings. But Magny has been in this position many times, and he has been known to fraud check many hype trains that seemingly cannot be beat. Overall, Michael Morales has 16 wins with 0 losses. He has 11 knockout wins, 1 submission win, and has won 4 decisions, 7 of those finishes being in the very first round. I'm picking Michael Morales to beat Magny, but there are many questions that need to be answered before I can confidently say that he will be champion one day. What are your guys' opinions on Michael Morales? Do you think that he'll be in the top 10, top 5, or do you think that he'll even become champion? And who do you think is going to win this fight? Will he be fraud checked, or will he pass Neil Magny with flying colors? You know what week it is? It's Raul Rosas Jr.'s fight week. The man who was born in 2004 was in the UFC before he even graduated high school, the youngest fighter the UFC has ever signed, and it is finally time to break down his career this far. Like and subscribe. As stated in the beginning, Raul was born October 8th, 2004. He stands at 5'9" and trains out of a very famous gym, 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu. A 14-year-old Raul made his amateur debut, by far the youngest fighter I have seen in the amateur scene. He had 4 fights in one night in the Youth MMA World Championships promotion. He won all 4 fights, submitting 2 opponents and beat the other 2 by decision. In January of 2020, a 15-year-old Raul would have another amateur fight, this time sinking in another submission and getting the win just 2 minutes into the very first round. Raul would wait over a year to have another amateur fight, eventually fighting again in April of 2021, beating his opponent by submission once again, just 1 minute into the first round. Raul was already looking like he was UFC bound before exiting the amateur scene, so a young and motivated Raul would make his professional debut just a month after his 16th birthday, and in November of 2021, he would make his long-awaited debut, fighting Eduardo Velasquez. Raul would come out like a Tasmanian devil, taking his opponent down, snatching his back, and getting in the rear naked choke just 1 minute and 1 second into the fight. After his fiery debut, he would fight again a few months later in March of 2022. At just 17 years old, his opponent would be Joel Pena. This would be just another walk in the park for the young fighter, as he would sink in another perfect armbar submission just 54 seconds into the first round. After back-to-back 1-minute finishes, he would go into his next fight with a ton of confidence. Fighting again just 1 month later, on April 29th, 2022, Raul would fight Francisco Villanueva. This would be yet another walk in the park for the young prodigy, because he would sink in another armbar just 2 minutes into the first round. With 3 wins in a row, Raul would waste no time in fighting again, and in May of that same year, Raul would fight Jose Penaloza. This wouldn't be another first round finish, but he would still get the rear naked choke in the second round. Raul would fight again just 3 weeks later, in June of 2022. He would face off with Andreas Pineda, and this fight fight would go just as smoothly as his previous fights, getting the TKO just 2 minutes into the first round. After getting 5 wins in less than 1 year, he would get the attention of the biggest promotion in the world, the UFC. But due to Raul being 17 years old, he would need to fight on Dana White's Contender Series to prove that he was as good as everyone was saying. And in September of 2022, Raul would do just that, this time fighting Mando Gutierrez. This was not a walk in the park for him, but it was still a very dominant and very impressive performance from Raul, with him winning by unanimous decision. Dana White usually doesn't sign fighters who go to decision. However, Raul showed him that he was still very dangerous and had a ton of potential. He was very dangerous and he had potential to become a star in no time. So Dana would sign the 17-year-old, and the second he did, people knew to keep an eye on this fighter because he truly had potential to become a champion if he played his cards right and kept up the grind. And in December of 2022, Raul would make his heavily anticipated UFC debut, with his opponent being Jay Perrin, and in classic Raul fashion, he would steamroll his opponent by base cranking the daylights out of Perrin and forcing the tap just 2 minutes into the first round. This would make waves in the MMA scene, with people giving Raul a lot of props and a lot of credit and speculating if he would eventually become UFC champion, as well as fans joking around saying, imagine being a 30-year-old and getting smoked by a 17-year-old that was still in high school. After making his electrifying debut, Raul would slow his roll and focus on finishing high school and improving his craft. And in April of 2023, Raul would make his highly anticipated second showing in the UFC. This time his opponent would be Christian Rodriguez. This would be a very hard fight that tested Raul's cardio and chin, and this would be Raul's first and only loss, losing by unanimous decision. Some are quick to write off Raul as just another hyped up prospect who would get weeded out of the UFC sooner or later, while the majority of fans knew he was still very talented and was still very young to be at the level he is currently at, and still saw the potential that Raul possessed. Raul would travel around and train with more fighters, with Aljamain Sterling training with Raul as well as Merab Dvalishvili. After learning how to not drain his gas tank and chase for the finish too much, he would make the walk once again in September of that same year. This time he would be fighting Terrence Mitchell. This would be one of the fastest finishes in his career. In just 54 seconds he would get the TKO win. With the loss behind him and getting another fantastic finish in the UFC, he would be in the spotlight once again, and Raul would get a jump up in competition, this time fighting another up and coming fighter with a good amount of height, Ricky Turcios. Fans were excited for this matchup because both fighters have a fast pace and finish most of their fights. And in June of 2024, the fight would happen. Once the ref said fight, it was clear as day which fighter was better. Raul put on a relentless pace and was dominating Ricky throughout the first round. And in the second round, Raul finally get the rear naked choke finish and impressed the fans. Not only did he show a ton of improvement since his loss, he seemingly filled his frame and looked stronger. And that brings us to this weekend. Raul is fighting Ailin at the Las Vegas Sphere on the UFC Noche card. This is a huge opportunity for Raul to get his name out there even farther. Raul currently has a record of 9 wins and 1 loss, with 2 knockout wins, 6 submission wins, and 1 decision win, with his only loss being by decision. He is currently only 19 years old. His whole career ahead of him. Now, Raul's opponent is not a new fighter by any means. Ailin has 25 wins and 11 losses, meaning he has a lot more experience than Raul. Ailin also has a 64% decision rate when he wins, and he has been finished 4 times. So with that being said, I think Raul will put on a relentless pace and get the submission in either the first or the second round. However, Aillin's experience might give Raul issues if he chases the finish too much, but if he comes in calm and collected and focuses on getting the fight to the ground, he will have an easy path to victory. Today, we will be talking about the man who has taken the UFC by storm. The man who has long hair in the back and an emo cut in the front. The man who has a scar on his throat from getting impaled by a steel object, as he put it. That's right, it is finally time to break down Diego Lopes. Like and subscribe. Diego Lopes was born December 30th, 1994, and was raised in Manaus, Amazonas, Brazil. Lopes began training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at a young age, as it was a tradition in his family to fight. Quickly began competing at the age of 7, and at 16 he received his purple belt and soon after transitioned to MMA. He currently trains out of Lobo Gym and fights in the 145-pound featherweight division. Let's stop the yapping and get right into his MMA career. Lopes had his first professional MMA fight in September of 2012, with his first opponent being Francevaldo Aravo. Lopes would smoke Francevaldo like a blunt in the hood by knocking him out at the start of the second round. So with his debut out of the way, Lopes would take his second fight in February of 2013, this time fighting Renel da Costa. This would go just as well as his debut. Lopes would knock out his opponent once again in the second round. Lopes would fight again just 2 months later in July. His opponent would be Luis Silva. Lopes wouldn't look for the knockout this time because he would take his opponent down and sink in a brutal armbar, forcing the ref to step in and stop the fight. After achieving his third finish in a row, Lopes would fight once more in November of that same year, this time facing off with Thiago Silva. This looked easy on paper, but it would be quite the opposite. It would be a very close fight that tested both men, leaving it up to the judges to decide who is the winner. And unfortunately, it was not Lopes. He would end up losing a razor-close split decision. After taking his first loss, a 19-year-old Diego would move over to Mexico and take up a job offer given to him to train some athletes. He would do this in between fights. Diego would take his next fight in April of 2014. This would be another very hard fight for Diego. Not only would he take another loss, but he would get knocked out in the second round. Things were not looking good for Diego. Not only is his record 3 wins with 2 losses, he took those losses back-to-back times. Diego would continue to train his students and fix some holes in his game. Diego would take his next fight in July of that same year, this time fighting Isaac Silva. This would go swimmingly for Lopes because in the second round he would sink in a rear naked choke and force the tap. After getting back into the win column, Lopes would take another fight to finish off the year, and that opponent would be Jose Dos Santos on the MMA Superheroes 7 card. Diego would come out guns blazing and finish his opponent in just 2 minutes into the first round, his fastest finish to date. Fun fact, this card had 2 other fighters who would eventually make it to the big leagues, those being Berna Jandaroba and Ariane Lipsky, and obviously the person in this video, Diego Lopes. After getting back-to-back finishes, Diego was riding high going into the new year, and he would face off with Duda Sales in April of 2015. This would turn out to be another fantastic performance from Lopes because he would showcase his jiu-jitsu once again and sink in a career-ending heel hook and force the opponent to tap in just 3 minutes into the first round. Diego would take one more fight in September of 2015, this time fighting Gilberto Pantoja. This would get chalked down as another impressive performance from the up-and-coming Diego Lopes because he would sink in a triangle choke and get the finish. With his losses being far behind him, Diego would go into 2016 with more confidence than ever, and his first opponent would be Luis Torres in April. And once again, Lopes would come into the fight with a fire in his eyes and starch his opponent in the first minute of the first round. Lopes would take his time to train his students, as well as improve his own game, and in November, Diego would fight once again. His opponent would be Paul Marquez. Once again, Lopes would steamroll his opponent and get the submission finish in the very first round. Lopes was dominating the competition, and it wasn't going to stop anytime soon, and he would take his first fight in March of 2017 against Carlos Canada. This would be yet another walk in the park for the budding star, submitting his opponent with a rear naked choke in just 3 minutes into the first round. Lopes would take his next opponent. Lopes would take on his next opponent just 1 month in April. Lopes would take on his next opponent just 1 month later in April, this time fighting Raul Ocampo. This would be a first round finish because he would knock out Ocampo just 3 minutes into the fight. Lopes would fight a few months later in August of that same year when he would fight Isaac Ruales for the JFL featherweight belt. This would be yet another first round finish, winning by rear naked choke and getting his first belt wrapped around his waist. Lopes would take the rest of the year off and enjoy the fruits of his labor, fighting again in July of 2018, fighting Amir Alzarakev. This would turn out to be a very challenging fight for Lopes because he would get knocked out in the second round, ending his great 9-fight win streak. Most would take a long time off to recover, but Lopes isn't most. He would fight again just a few months later in June, this time fighting Antonio Hernandez for the XFL featherweight belt. Diego would waste no time getting back into the win column because he would submit Antonio just 1 minute into the first round and getting his second belt wrapped around his waist in 2 different promotions. After getting his second belt, Lopes would fight just 3 months later in August against Rogelio Meneses and once again smoke his opponent like some Delta 8 in Idaho, knocking him out in just 3 minutes into the first round. Once again, Lopes would take a 3-month turnaround and fight again in October of that same year, this time fighting Luis Guerrero. Lopes would continue his first round finishing streak by submitting Luis just 1 minute into the fight. Lopes would take 5 months off and fight again in March of 2019 when he would face off with Ronnie Becerra. This would be a hard fight, but Lopes would remain the winner, this time winning by decision. Lopes would fight again for the belt, this time in the Lux Fight League. His opponent would be Alejandro Rodriguez. This would turn out to be his longest fight to this point, going all 5 rounds and testing Diego's cardio like never before, but he would still end up on top and achieve his 3rd belt in 3 different promotions. His next fight would be in November of 2019. He would attempt to get his first title defense. The title challenger would be Marco Beltran. Lopes would go back to his finishing ways by sinking in a slick knee bar and force the tap in the very first round, getting his belt wrapped around his waist once again. Lopes would end up taking his longest layoff in his career due to the illness that shut down the world, eventually fighting again in March of 2021, attempting his second title defense against Maceo Fullen. This would turn out to be a tougher fight than expected, but as usual, Lopes would get the finish in the 3rd round and win by submission. All of these finishes would finally get the attention of the big man Dana White, and they would offer him a fight on the widely respected show, Dana White's Contender Series. His opponent would be Joe Anderson Brito, and on August 31st, 2021, Lopes would get the opportunity of a lifetime. This would turn out to be a very hard fight for Lopes. This would be a very hard fight for Lopes, which would end up to be a technical decision loss for Diego Lopes. After falling short of getting to fight in the UFC, Lopes would fight in Fury FC. Just a few months later in October, his opponent would be Nate Richardson. This was for the belt as well, but unlike all of his previous fights, this would be a hard-fought fight that ended up with Lopes on the wrong end of a split decision. Once again, he had lost 2 fights in a row, but he would never stop getting up after he fell down. Lopes would fight again in February of 2022, this time facing off with Ken Glenn, and he would jump right back into the win column and get the finish he was known for. A knockout in the last 21 seconds into the fight. A knockout in the last 21 seconds of the fight. Lopes would take his time to fight again and wait until November to make his well-known that well-known walk once again. His opponent would be Angel Rodriguez. This would turn out to be an easier fight for Lopes, knocking his opponent out in just 40 seconds into the 2nd round. Although Diego Lopes lost his fight on the Contender Series, Lopes would get the call from the UFC to fight a monster in the UFC, Movsar Evloev. This was akin to sending a lamb out for slaughter, especially if you consider the fight would have to be taken on short notice. But Lopes was never known to back down from a tough fight. He would accept this opportunity. Many people thought Lopes would get finished in the 1st round because many weren't aware of how good he really is. And in May of 2023, Lopes would make his UFC debut. This would be a back and forth scrap that had fans stunned at how competitive this fight was. But Evloev would end up getting the unanimous decision win. However, fans were impressed with Lopes. Not only did he challenge Evloev more than any other opponent had to that point, but some thought he should have even won. So the UFC were eager to see how this new fighter would fare against other fighters. So the UFC would offer Lopes another fight in August of that same year against Gavin Tucker, and this is where the fans would see how good Lopes really was, because Lopes would steamroll Tucker and sink in an armbar and get the submission win in just 90 seconds into the 1st round. After getting his first win under the UFC banner, Lopes would waste no time fighting again in November of 2023, going up against Pat Sabatini, and Lopes would not disappoint because he would run through Pat in just 90 seconds, knocking him out in devastating fashion. This would line him up to be on one of the best cards in UFC history, facing off with Sadiq Youssef on the massive UFC 300 card. On the biggest stage the UFC had seen in years, with many people feeling like Lopes might get knocked out by the heavy hitter. It made made for an interesting matchup, and the fight would commence. Lopes would show up and show out and put on a masterclass, once again getting a 90-second knockout and shocking the fans. After getting 3 finishes in a row and getting into the rankings, Lopes would get the fight with the number 3 contender, Brian Ortega, and in June of this year, he would make that walk, but Brian would pull out last minute, and there was another veteran begging for a chance to beat the rising star, Dan Ige. This was a fight that was made on the same day of the fights. Many people felt like Diego would get another first round knockout, but this would turn out to be a fantastic fight with both guys trading shots and testing how good Diego's boxing really was. This fight would get left to the judges, and Lopes would be awarded with another unanimous decision victory. After getting the win and staying in the rankings, Lopes would still want to fight Ortega and prove to the promotion that he is one of the best fighters in the division. And on September 14th, 2024, this previous weekend, he would be one of the few fighters to fight in the Las Vegas sphere and participate in being the first sport event to take place in the new arena. And this fight would not disappoint. Lopes would almost be the first fighter to knock out Ortega in the first round, but Ortega would showcase his chin and his heart, not only surviving the first round, but at times he was landing on Diego clean. But Diego landed the harder shots and dropped Ortega multiple times, and left Ortega with an eye that was swollen shut and walked out with a unanimous decision victory. After his hard fight, Lopes is still a coach, and he would be in Alexa Grasso's corner in the very next fight. That's how much of a savage this man is. Now he is ranked number 3 on the short list of fighters who might be able to fight the winner of Ilia Topuria versus Max Holloway for the UFC featherweight belt. Lopes is currently 29 years old with 26 wins and 6 losses. He has 10 knockouts, 12 submissions, and 4 decision wins. He has been knocked out 2 times and has lost 4 decisions. He has 6 knockouts in the first round and 9 submissions in the first round as well, with both of his knockout losses being in the second round. Overall, I do think Lopes has the potential to become champion, but he does leave himself open to counters when he throws shots, and he has been knocked out 2 times in the past. If he keeps improving and sharpening up his defense and improves his cardio, he could become champion one day. However, it is important to remember that many fighters don't reach their prime until 31 to 34 years old, so we still have a few years before we see Lopes at his very best. Many MMA fans ponder, who is the next champion? Who has the best, well-balanced skill set in the sport? Who is a name that I may have overlooked? Well, today, I might have the answer to all of those questions. If the title didn't give it away already, the man we are doing a potential prospect on is none other than Nassourdine Imavov. Like and subscribe. Imavov was born March 1st, 1995 to an ethnic Kumyk family in Dagestan, Russia. At the age of 9, Imavov moved with his family to Salon de Provence, France, where he started boxing. After that, he discovered MMA, and at 19, he moved to Paris with his older brother, Dagir, where they joined the MMA Factory, who at the time, the head coach was Fernando Lopes, which is a huge gym that trains fighters such as Cyril Gane, Ian Kutalaba, Veronica Hardy, and Cedric Doumbé, as well as many other great fighters. Imavov also stands at a staggering 6'3", which is on the taller end for middleweight. Nassourdine Imavov started his MMA career in the professionals. He made his MMA debut in February of 2016 against Nassourdine Ayadi. This would be a huge test for a fighter making his debut, because Ayadi already had an impressive 7-3 record. Nassourdine also started his career at welterweight. This fight would turn out to be too much for the inexperienced Imavov. He would find himself stuck in a guillotine choke and forced to tap at the end of the first round. This was a huge blow to Imavov's ego, but this would mean he already got his first loss out of the way and wouldn't feel the pressure to keep his record picture perfect. Imavov would waste no time in testing himself again once more. He would sign his second fight in March of that same year, fighting Said Magomed Tachayev. Imavov would come out with a fire lit under him and prove to the world that he can make it as a professional, and he would do just that by piecing Said up and taking him down and getting his back, therefore sinking in a beautiful rear naked choke and getting the submission finish in the first round, just 3 minutes in. After getting his first win, he would remain remain very active and sign up to fight just 1 month later in April. This time he would be fighting Yanis Charafa. This would turn out to be a very similar fight to his previous one, dominating Yanis and finding a crazy Bravo choke just 2 minutes into the first round. He would end up taking the rest of the year off to hang out and enjoy the fruits of his labor, as well as help his teammates train and sharpen up his own tools. In May of 2017, he would walk into that beautiful octagon once again, this time fighting Paul Lawrence. This would be yet another first round finish, but this time it would be a TKO in just 2 minutes into the fight. Imavov would take his time and have a full training camp, eventually fighting again in October of that same year, this time fighting Michael Michalski. This would be a far harder fight than many of his previous fights, but he would showcase his cardio and his striking, winning fight of the night, but ended up losing the fight in a decision loss. This was nothing but a bump in the road for the still budding prospect. Imavov would want to stay active and get back into the win column. He would fight again just 1 month after his loss in November of that same year. This time his opponent would be Gary Formosa, and he would starch Gary just 2 minutes into the fight, getting the knockout in the very first round. This was a huge win for Imavov, and he would end up taking more than a year off to sharpen his game, as well as help train his teammates. Fast forward to May of 2019, Imavov would fight once again, this time fighting Gregor Weibel. This would be a back and forth scrap with crazy moments on the feet as well as fun scrambles, but Imavov would win the majority of the exchanges, therefore he would get his hand raised when the ref read the scorecards. Nassourdine Imavov would end up fighting just 2 months later in July, this time facing off against Francisco de Montes. This is where Imavov would make his middleweight debut as well. This would be a one-sided beatdown that left one man fresh as a daisy and the other fast asleep catching some Z's, after Imavov sunk in a nasty rear naked choke just 2 minutes into the fight, after going on a 3-fight win streak and getting some momentum going, and his last loss far behind him. He would fight again in September of 2019. This time he was set to trade knuckles with Mateusz Gluch for the TFL welterweight belt, but this would be less of trading hands and more trying to rip Gluch's arm clean off after sinking in a Kimura in the first round, getting the finish and his first and only belt wrapped around his waist. Many lesser fighters would have taken the rest of the year off, but Nassourdine was hyped up and wanted to fight again as soon as possible, and he would get his wish answered, and he would fight again in December of that same year, this time fighting Jonathan Moaner. This would turn out to be yet another one-sided bullying session, with Nassourdine getting the TKO finish in the first round once again. Nassourdine was gaining hype all around France and other surrounding countries. The whispers would get all the way to the biggest promotion in the world, the UFC, and he would skip the usual testing grounds and have him fight on a UFC card immediately. In October of 2020, Imavov would take the first big step to making his dreams come true. His opponent would be Jordan Williams. This is where he would make his delighted return to middleweight as well, with the lights shining bright and the ref saying fight. Imavov would showcase his extremely high level of striking, dismantling Williams time after time. The fight would go all 3 rounds, and Imavov would win by unanimous decision, to nobody's surprise. After winning his long-awaited UFC debut, Imavov would fight again in February of 2021, stepping up to fight an up-and-coming Phil Hawes. This would be a spectacular fight that once again would test both men. However, no one would end up getting the finish, so therefore it would go to the judges to decide the winner, and Phil Hawes would get the nod from the judges. Imavov had gotten his first loss in the UFC, but it is important to remember how good Phil Hawes was. Outside of his chin being super weak, Phil had phenomenal striking and a great ground game. If he didn't have one of the worst chins in the UFC, he would be a legit problem in the division. But a loss is a loss, and Nassourdine took it in stride. Imavov would take his next fight just a few months later in July of 2021. His opponent would be the newcomer Ian Heinisch. Imavov was a favorite going into the fight, and for good reason, because once the ref said fight, it was a one-sided smackdown that left Ian battered and bruised, with the ref stepping in to stop the fight in the second round, and Imavov got the TKO win once again. Imavov would stay busy and fight once more in 2021 in November. He would get matched up with Ronda Rousey's prodigy, Edmund Shabazian, who was ranked number 15. Many thought Edmund would knock out Imavov, but others saw how good he really was, so it was a toss-up. But once the fight happened, it was clear as day who was the better fighter. That man man was Nassourdine Imavov, because in the second round he would land brutal ground and pound elbows that left Edmund defenseless and the ref stopping the fight, getting Imavov the TKO win once again for the second time in a row. Imavov would take the rest of the year off as well as most of 2022, eventually finding a matchup in September of 2022 against another star with one of the best knockouts in the UFC, Jaquan Buckley. This would be another banger, with both men landing hard shots and going back and forth in the grappling exchanges, but Nassourdine had gotten the better of the exchanges the longer the fight went on, and once the last bell rang, it was no question that he had done more than enough to get the unanimous decision win. With the momentum building, as well as getting closer and closer to the championship belt, Nassourdine would fight a former champion and fan favorite, Sean Strickland. But it was a weird build-up because Nassourdine was supposed to fight Kelvin Gastelum, but Kelvin had to pull out on fight week, but Strickland would step in with the condition that he could fight at light heavyweight. Imavov had already made it close to the 185-pound weight limit, so he agreed and stopped cutting weight. Overall, Imavov would weigh in at 194 pounds. With the weirdness of the build-up out of the way, and Imavov making his 205-pound debut, the fight would finally happen. It was a rough fight for both fighters, but more specifically, Imavov. Strickland showcased his fantastic jab and relentless front kicks to the body, which had Imavov confused on how to get past it without eating shots, and it would end up costing him the fight because he would end up losing by unanimous decision and get outclassed for all 5 rounds. Imavov had lost his win streak and got embarrassed, but that loss aged pretty well considering that Strickland is widely considered to be one of the best middleweights in the world right now, and Strickland also dethroned the middleweight king, Israel Adesanya. So, fast forward a few months to June, Sean Strickland's best friend would get the matchup with Imavov, Chris Action Man Curtis. This was another huge test for Imavov, but he has never been known to back down from a scrap. This would turn out to be a great fight, with Imavov looking like he will get the decision win or another TKO finish in the 3rd round. But 3 minutes into the 2nd round, they would clash heads, with Chris Curtis taking the brunt of the collision. Therefore, it would get chalked down as a no contest. After that blunder, Imavov would take the rest of the year off and eventually fight again in February of this year, 2024, when he would get matched up with Roman Dolidze, headlining his 2nd card. This would be a close fight on paper, but once the fight happened, it was one-way traffic for Imavov. He would piece up Roman and dominate the clinch for all 5 rounds, and get awarded the majority decision victory. After winning his first main event, Imavov would waste no time in fighting again. This time he would get a jump up in the rankings against a former title challenger, Jared Cannonier. This was a fantastic fight that showcased their power, cardio, and chins, but in the 4th round, Imavov had landed some clean shots that had Jared stumbling time after time, and eventually the ref would step in and stop the fight. Imavov would get the standing TKO finish. This was controversial because many people felt like Jared was still in the fight and had a good shot at getting the win. And that brings us to this weekend. Nassourdine is fighting another up-and-coming prospect, Brandon Allen. Nassourdine Imavov has 14 wins with 4 losses. He has 6 knockout wins, 4 submission wins, and 4 decision wins. He has been submitted 1 time in his professional debut, and his other 3 losses have all been by decision. He is currently ranked number 4 in the UFC middleweight division. It is safe to say that the winner of this fight very well might fight for the belt in their next fight. Overall, this is a hard fight to pick. Both men are elite level and have a good chance at winning, but I always pick fights that I break down, and I think that Imavov will get the job done, especially if Ailin can't take Imavov down. So I'm going to go with Nassourdine Imavov by TKO in the 3rd round, but I also wouldn't be surprised if he wins by decision. Today, we are going to Japan, the land with an interesting history and culture. But we aren't looking too deeply into that. We are looking into one of their best fighters and possibly the most thankful and happiest fighters coming out of Naha, Okinawa. This man was born January 27th in the year 2000. That man is Tatsuro Taira. Many people assume that a fighter that is as young as he is and as high level as he is must have been training since he was a small child. Well, you'd be right most of the time. Tatsuro Taira is not one of those stories. Tatsuro actually started his sports career playing basketball in the 3rd grade all the way up to middle school, but he wasn't passionate about it and decided to take a break from the sport. Once he got into high school, he would be inspired by his older brother to try out kickboxing. At his local gym soon after starting kickboxing, he would transition to MMA. He had won an amateur Shudo tournament as well as the All Japan Amateur Shudo Championship tournament. He would end up going 10-0 in his amateur Shudo fights as well. Tatsuro Taira had made his professional debut on August 3rd, 2018, and his opponent would be Yo Otake in the quarterfinals in the Shudo tournament. This would turn out to be a one-sided beatdown that left Otake sleeping after being submitted with a triangle choke just 2 minutes into the first round. After steamrolling his opponent in his first fight, Taira would fight a few months later in the finals in November 2018. His opponent would be Ryo Yakawa, and in similar fashion to his last fight, Taira would put his opponent to sleep with a front choke just 3 minutes into the first round. Therefore, Taira would win the tournament. After winning the tournament and going 2-0, Taira would move down to men's strawweight, which is 115 pounds. His first fight at 115 would be in June of 2019. His opponent would be Yuta Sakaguchi. This would be a challenging fight for the young fighter, but at the end, Taira would win by unanimous decision. After this fight, Taira would move back up to flyweight. He would fight again in September of that same year, this time facing off with Takehiro Kahori. This would be another steamrolling from Taira because just 1 minute into the fight, he would take his opponent down and rain vicious ground and pound shots until the ref stepped in and stopped the fight. Taira would stay active and take on his next opponent just 2 months later in November against Yamato Takagi, and once again, he would rain brutal ground and pound and force the ref to step in, getting another TKO win in the first round. Taira would take December off and would fight again in January of 2020, this time facing off with Jared Almazan. This would go longer than his last two fights, but Taira would still get the finish in the second round after yet again raining brutal ground and pound. Taira would take a few months off and fight again in November. This fight would be at bantamweight against Kiyotaka Shimizu. Similar to the last time he moved down in weight, it would be a harder fight than expected, but he would still get the win by unanimous decision. Taira would take the rest of the year off and fight again in March of 2021. This time he would be facing off with Yashiro Maeda, but Taira would sink in the old reliable rear naked choke in the first minute of the fight. This would be more than enough to get the title shot at flyweight. He would be fighting the champion Yuya Fukuda in July of 2021. This would turn out to be yet another walk in the park for Taira because he would sink in a triangle choke just 4 minutes into the first round and getting his first belt wrapped around his waist at just 21 years of age. Taira would switch promotions to the Vale Tudo Japan, also known as VTJ, on November 6, 2021. His first opponent in the new promotion would be Alfredo Muad, and once again Taira would smoke his opponent in the first round by rear naked choke. Taira was now 9-0 with most of his fights ending in a finish. This would catch the attention of the biggest promotion in the world, the UFC, and Taira would be scheduled to fight Carlos Pelanero on April 30th, 2022. But unfortunately, Carlos would get sick and the fight would be rescheduled for May 14th. And once the fight would take place, it would be a one-sided beatdown once again, but he would be unable to get the finish before the fight ended. But Taira would once again win by unanimous decision. After winning his UFC debut, he would fight again just a few months later in October against CJ Vergara. This would be a great fight, but Taira would get the armbar finish at the end of the second round. He would also get a $50,000 performance bonus after this great performance. Taira would stay active and fight again in February of 2023 against Jesus Aguilar. This would be yet another steamrolling for the up-and-coming prospect, sinking in the triangle armbar in the first round, getting the win and yet another $50,000 performance bonus. Taira would be scheduled for another fight against Clayton Rodriguez, but Rodriguez would miss weight and the fight would get cancelled. So he would fight again just 2 weeks later in July against Edgar Chairez, and it would be another one-sided beatdown that left the judges no question as to who won the fight, and once again Taira would get the unanimous decision win. Taira would want to fight again before the end of the year, so he would sign another fight against David Dvorak in October, but it would get cancelled due to Dvorak being injured. So Taira would get a new opponent in December. That opponent would be Carlos Hernandez, and once again Taira would dominate Carlos and get the huge left hook that dropped him, and then Taira would finish him off with some vicious ground and pound in the second round. After getting 3 wins in the UFC in 2023, he would go into 2024 with a ton of momentum, so he would sign up to fight a UFC veteran in May. That veteran was Tim Elliott, but unfortunately, this fight would also get cancelled due to Elliott pulling out. So the UFC would give Taira another fight, so the UFC would have Taira fight another up-and-coming prospect, Joshua Van. Unfortunately, this fight would get cancelled as well, but they were both rebooked to fight different opponents, as the UFC did not want two prospects fighting each other so early on in their careers. Taira's new opponent would be a huge step up in competition. That opponent would be Alex Perez, a very experienced veteran who just had a huge win over Mateus Nicolau. But Taira would pass this test with flying colors, not only showcasing his very high level fight IQ, but also his grappling, and it would be his grappling that would injure Perez's knee and force the fight to be stopped. His knee was hurt due to Taira landing a takedown by taking Alex's back and Taira's leg behind Alex's leg to try and trip him while he pulls back, which he pulled off perfectly, but unfortunately it would lead to the knee injury. But on the bright side, Taira would get awarded the TKO win. And that brings us to this weekend. Taira is set to face off with another high-level veteran in Brandon Royval, who has a 16-7 record with some nasty knockouts. But we aren't talking about Royval today. We are talking about the Japanese prospect. As you can tell, Taira has yet to get a single loss on his resume, as well as not having any split decision wins. All of them have been dominant, unanimous decisions. If you include his amateur fights, he is on an amazing 25-fight win streak at just 24 years old. Taira also has a 31% knockout rate and a 44% submission rate, with only 25% of his fights going to the judges. So if you do the quick math, this would mean Taira has a 75% finishing rate at flyweight, which puts him in the top 10% in his division. So it goes without saying who I'm picking in this fight. I think Tatsuro Taira will get the win, and he will probably end up submitting Royval either in the 3rd round or the 4th round. Royval comes out with very high energy and a very high output, which will lead him to gassing out the farther the fight goes, which is where Taira will shine. Julianna, the Venezuelan vixen Pena, has had the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, as well as some legal issues sprinkled in there for good measure. Pena has won multiple awards in her career, such as Performance of the Night 2 times, the UFC Honors 2021 Performance of the Year, as well as 2021 Upset of the Year. But before we break down her long and decorated career, we will dive into her upbringing and background. Like and subscribe. Julianna was born August 19th, 1989, being raised by her parents Pamela Pena and Ernie Pena in the big city of Spokane, Washington. She is the youngest of 4 siblings, and her older sister was a meteorologist for the local news, Creme 2. She was an aggressive child as well as an overweight one at that. Pena would go on to graduate at Spokane Community College, so when she was 19, her sisters would encourage her to try out cardio kickboxing, not only to lose a few lbs, but get out some of her aggression. She would use the skills she gathered from the class to enter into the growing sport of MMA, and in 2009, she would have 3 amateur fights, winning the first against Kate Bell by decision on February 5th. Her second amateur fight was against Cynthia Hernandez on February 28th, winning by knockout in the very first round. Then her final amateur fight would be for an amateur title, taking place on May 9th, 2009. Her opponent would be Raylene Harvey. She would end up winning by submission just 2 minutes into the first round. After winning her amateur belt and getting a lot of confidence, she would turn pro later that same year in the Promotion International Fighting Championships, also known as the IFC, therefore making her pro debut on August 15th, 2009 against Robin Dunne. This would be one of many dominant performances from Julianna Pena, because in the first round, she would knock out her opponent. Pena would waste no time to fight again, making her second walk into the cage on December 5th, 2009 against Stephanie Weber. Fun fact, Weber was scheduled to fight Fallon Fox in 2012. If you know, you know. Now, back to your regularly scheduled program. Pena would sink in an armbar 2 minutes into the second round and get the submission win over Weber. She would take 2010 off to focus on improving her skills, more specifically her wrestling and jiu-jitsu. Pena would make her return on December 15th, 2011, when she would face off with Rachel Swartz. This would be nothing less of domination, because in the second round, Pena would sink in a guillotine choke and get her third win in a row, all of them ending in a finish. But some unfortunate event would take place when Pena was driving home from the gym. She would be hit head-on by a drunk driver, breaking her nose as well as knocking her unconscious from the accident. This happened in February 2012. Pena would fight again in April of 2012, this time facing off with future UFC fighter Sarah Moraes, just 2 months later after the accident. This would turn out to be a much more competitive fight than all of her previous fights, but in the second round she would not tap to a very deep armbar, and it was obvious that her arm sustained severe damage that forced the doctor to stop the fight, making this not only her first loss, but a TKO loss as well. Pena was in a rough spot after taking the loss. She was supposed to fight Claudia Gadelha in October of 2012, but the event would be cancelled, so she would take the rest of 2012 off, not only to recover, but further improve her game. She would make her eventual return on February 8th, 2013, when she would face off with another future UFC fighter, Deanna Bennett. This would be a very hard fight that tested both women, and it would end up going to the judges, and Julianna Pena would not get the nod, losing by unanimous decision. Things were looking bleak, taking her second loss in a row, but Pena would get the attention of the UFC due to her finishes and her personality, and they would give her a huge opportunity because it would be the first season that would be coached by two women superstar, Ronda Rousey and another well-known fighter, Miesha Tate. Pena was the first pick for Miesha Tate, which speaks to the potential that the coach saw in her, especially considering she had lost her last two fights. The season had a few great WMMA fighters, such as current champion Raquel Pennington and UFC veteran Roxanne Modafferi. Pena would shine on the show, beating Gina Mazzani in the first fight by unanimous decision. She would win her next fight by rear naked choke against Shayna Dazier, and redeeming her loss against Sarah Moraes by sinking in a guillotine choke. After clearing out the Tough House, she would go to the finals and fight for the $100,000 contract. The other finalist would be a decorated boxer, Jessica Racki. Many felt like Pena would get knocked out due to the good boxing of Jessica, but once the ref said fight, it was the opposite. Julianna would outbox her opponent as well as dominate her in the clinch that would lead to a takedown. Julianna would then land brutal ground and pound that forced the ref to step in and stop the fight. All of this happened in the very first round. Julianna had won the six-figure contract and got to learn from one of the best pioneers of WMMA, that being Miesha Tate. After clearing out the tough competition and bringing home the contract, she would be scheduled to fight Jessica Andrade in March of 2014, but it would get cancelled due to Pena wanting to train more. Her coach did not want her to continue to train, but she had snuck into wrestling practice and then ended up tearing her ACL, MCL, and LCL, as well as meniscus and hamstring. So basically just destroying her leg, according to ESPN, leaving Pena out of service for a year. Eventually she would fully recover and get back into action, making that well-known walk she has come to love on April 4th, 2015, when she would fight Melinda Dueva. Pena would run through her opponent, taking her down and raining brutal ground and pound that would force the ref to step in and stop the fight, getting the TKO win just 3 minutes into the first round, as well as being awarded a $50,000 performance bonus. After getting the first round TKO in her first official fight in the UFC that wasn't tied to the Ultimate Fighter, she would take her next fight just a few months later in October when she would fight Jessica Ai. This wouldn't be nearly as easy of a fight for Pena. It would turn into a back and forth scrap that had Pena winning the majority of the exchanges. When the fight was over, it was clear Pena had done more than enough to get the unanimous decision. After this fight in December, Pena would go to the bar with her training partners. Well, Josh Gao was one of her training partners. And this is a quote about the situation. Pena, identified in the report as Julianna Nicole Pena, told Officer Eric Kahnberg she had been in a fight involving 20 people outside of the Globe Bar kitchen. She and Gao had been injured. She said she went to a bar nearby Zola's, where she said she knew the owner. An employee of Zola's told one officer, "Everyone in the bar knows Pena is a UFC fighter." The employee said the fighters attempted to enter the bar after it was closed. They were told by the bartenders and bouncers they couldn't use the restroom because it had just been cleaned. According to multiple witness statements, Pena became enraged and lunged at one employee who shoved her toward the door. Pena allegedly kicked two employees in the groin, one of them twice, as they tussled with Wither, and Gao. It took several people to control the UFC fighter before she and Gao were shoved out of the bar. In the confusion, the allegedly assaulted employee reported the fighters took his cell phone. Pena was later searched and officers found 3 cell phones in her purse, though the employees did not wish to pursue charges. Police, however, took Pena into custody for allegedly assaulting 2 subjects at the bar, end quote. With the condition that Pena would not get into any other incidents for a year, the charges would be dropped. It wasn't a good look for Pena, but considering she had gone without further incident for almost a decade at this point, I personally wouldn't hold this against her. Now that we have the legal issues out of the way, let's get back on track. Pena would take her next fight against another big name who had just fought Ronda Rousey and lost, Kat Zingano, on July 9th, 2016, and Pena would shine bright once again because she would outclass the former contender, winning this fight by unanimous decision. After getting a huge win over a tough opponent, Julianna would get another huge opportunity to take on one of the best WMMA fighters of all time, Valentina the Bullet Shevchenko. In January of 2017, she would make that walk for a shot to be one of the few fighters to beat the Bullet. Unfortunately, she would be one of many to fall short of getting that win, because in the second round, she would get caught in an armbar and forced to tap. This was a rough loss for Pena, because even back then, she always felt like she was the best fighter. After taking the loss, Pena would add a pint-sized addition to her family, giving birth to her daughter in January of 2018. Pena would take the rest of 2018 off to not only recover from giving birth, but she would want to take care of her baby until she was at least 1 year old. Pena would make a return on July 13th, 2019, facing off with the first women's flyweight champion, Nico Manano. This was a huge shot for Pena to be a former champion, and Pena would not disappoint. The first round was not going Pena's way, getting beat in the clinch game, but making it to round 2. But in round 2, Pena would land more punches than Nico, as well as out-wrestling Nico by getting into more dominant positions, and in the third round would be more dominant for Pena, winning rounds 2 and 3, and without a question, she had won the fight by unanimous decision. After getting back into the win column, Pena would be scheduled to fight up-and-coming prospect Aspen Ladd on March 28, 2020, but this fight would be cancelled due to Pena getting injured, so she would recover and sign up to fight another former champion, Jermaine Durandamy, on October 3rd, 2020. But unlike Pena's last fight, it would not go as smoothly, as Durandamy was a world champion in Muay Thai. She was way better on the feet than Pena, which led to Pena being somewhat sloppy on the ground, trying to sink in Hail Mary submissions, which would turn out to be null, as Durandamy would seize the opportunity in the third round and sink in a guillotine choke and get the finish, making this Pena's second loss in the UFC. Pena was once again in a tough spot, getting finished by submission in both of her losses in the promotion, but she still felt like she was the best. She just needed to be more patient and learn how to effectively strike with another great striker. She would be scheduled to fight Sarah McMahon on January 23rd, 2021 on the prelims of the Poirier vs. McGregor rematch, as McGregor cards always draw more eyes from casual fans, and she would not let this opportunity go to waste because she would put on a dominant performance, therefore sealing the deal in the third round by sinking in a rear naked choke. This would garner some fans, but it wasn't big enough to make her a star overnight, so she would be scheduled to fight Holly Holm on May 8th, 2021. Unfortunately, Holm would get injured and the fight would get cancelled, so Pena would get the opportunity of a lifetime, with her getting set up to fight the greatest WMMA athlete of all time, Amanda Nunes, on August 7th, 2021, but this would get cancelled due to Nunes getting sick with the illness that ends in 19. So the fight would get rescheduled to December 11th, 2021 due to Pena talking a ton of trash and claiming she will beat Amanda, which was big talk considering Pena would be a plus 700 underdog once the fight would take place. This fight did nothing but shock the entire UFC fan base. Pena would not only end up beating Amanda, but she would outstrike her on the feet, as well as taking her down and sinking in a rear naked choke just 3 minutes into the second round, shocking the world and proving all of the doubters wrong and becoming one of the biggest names in WMMA overnight. To make the night even sweeter, she would get all of those awards that we mentioned in the beginning of the video. The biggest 2021 upset and the UFC Honors Performance of the Year of 2021, which is pretty crazy considering a lot of people didn't know who she was before this fight took place. After finally achieving her dream and proving to the world that she was indeed as good as she always claimed that she was, she would be riding high with interviews, and she would gain 3 300,000 followers on Instagram in one night. While not every follower will buy her pay-per-views, it is a good tell that she made a huge impression on the UFC fans, and there would undoubtedly be much more eyes on her next fight. With Nunes being a dominant champion, the automatic rematch would take place on July 30th, 2022. As all of you watching are aware, where there is a peak, there is a valley, not too far ahead. And the rematch would be the valley for Pena, because once the ref said fight, Nunes had countered Pena time after time, and Pena would get bested on the ground by Nunes. But Pena did hang in there and kept trying to get the win, but it would turn out to be all for nothing because Pena would lose by unanimous decision. After losing the belt she had fought so hard for, she would take the rest of the year off to spend with her baby and husband. With Pena becoming a star and no other contenders who earned a title shot, the UFC would rebook the fight for a third time. They were set to fight on June 10th, 2023, but Pena withdrew to the fight due to her breaking her ribs in training camp. And that brings us to this weekend. Pena has another shot at the belt, fighting Raquel Pennington, former roommates of the Ultimate Fighter house, but they did not get along due to Pennington saying out of everyone in the Tough House, she would be most likely to beat up Pena, which hurt Pena's feelings because she would say, "Why me, Raquel? I put you in my high heels, I did your makeup so beautiful, I gave you my dresses, and taught you how to walk like a lady, and now you're going to kick me out of the house? For what? This is BS. And she said it was because I was too loud, and I said, I'm just going to practice, dude. Like I don't even know what you're talking about. So anyways, she wasn't able to get past Jessica Ratchey, and that was somebody that I dominated and that I finished. And so, like I said, we've had this brewing for a long time now. I hope you enjoyed my Pena impression. So it goes without saying, this is a grudge match. I will give you my prediction, but first, we must break down Pena's numbers. Pena has 10 wins with 5 losses. She has 3 TKO wins in the first round, 3 submissions in the second round, and 1 in the third. She has 3 decision wins. She has been TKO'd 1 time in the second round due to the doctor stoppage. She has been submitted 2 times, once in the second round and once in the third round, as well as losing 2 decisions. Now for my prediction. Pennington has good boxing, but she isn't good at stuffing takedowns, more specifically, the single leg takedown, as she has a habit of going for a guillotine to stuff a double leg, which is a good submission but bad for stopping single leg takedowns. And Pena's jiu-jitsu is the most polished part of her game, so I doubt a guillotine will get her out of the fight like it did earlier in her career. And when Pena is on top, she does a great job at keeping great positions, so if she can find a submission or even grind out Pennington's cardio, I could easily see Pena beating Covington by unanimous decision. Alex Pereira was born on July 7, 1987, in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He grew up in one of Brazil's infamous favelas. For those of you who don't know what a favela is, it is a slum or a shantytown located within or on the outskirts of the country's large cities, especially Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. Alex dropped out of middle school to work as a bricklayer's assistant and would eventually work at a tire shop. Pereira's journey into the world of kickboxing started as a way for him to kick a drinking problem he had picked up from his work associates at the tire shop. He started honing his striking skills in a gym not far from his home in 2009, but little did he know, stardom was on the horizon. 4 years later, Pereira started taking amateur kickboxing matches, going 2-1 before deciding to turn pro. He won the Brazilian 187-pound championship in his first professional fight against Clay Silva, and went on to win a couple more belts before transitioning to Glory. He won the promotion's middleweight title during his second outing and went on to defend the belt 5 times. One of his most notable wins during his Glory run was his victories against fellow kickboxing star Israel Adesanya. Little did either man know they would end up being rivals in a different sport. Alex would fight a couple of future UFC fighters such as Dustin Jacoby and Cesar Almeida 3 times during his kickboxing reign. Pereira would make the bold decision to transition from kickboxing to MMA in 2015, losing his first fight via rear naked choke. The allure of new challenges and the opportunity to test convinced his skills in the cage were irresistible, especially given the success of his rival, Israel Adesanya. Despite his immense success in kickboxing, the switch to MMA was no easy task. The transition from the striking-focused world of kickboxing to the multifaceted realm of MMA was a daunting one, but Pereira was determined to make it work. He made his MMA debut in Jungle Fight on October 24th, 2015. His opponent would be Quamel Atani. This is where Alex would find out just how hard it can be to get out of submissions if you haven't trained properly, because he would get caught in the old-fashioned rear naked choke. Pereira now understood that succeeding in MMA required a different skill set. He committed himself to rigorous training circled around Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and wrestling. After training and learning the ins and outs of MMA, Alex would make his second fight in the new sport in January of 2016, fighting Marcelo Cruz. Alex would showcase his power he is known for today, knocking Cruz out just 4 minutes into the fight. Alex would transition back to kickboxing, achieving a win over Israel Adesanya and a title win over Antonio Dos Santos Jr. Just 4 months after his last MMA fight, he would take another fight in May of 2016. This time he would fight Marcus Vinicius. This wouldn't be quite as easy of a fight, but Alex would still find the kill shot 4 minutes into the second round. May I add, this card was stacked with future UFC talent such as Paulo Costa, Davison Figueiredo, Polyana Viana, and Lucas Almeida. Alex still wasn't completely sold on MMA, so he would go back to kickboxing and fight 12 more times, beating the likes of Israel Adesanya for the second time and Jason Wilness. Alex would make his temporary return to MMA in November of 2020, leaving Jungle Fight for the LFA. His opponent would be Thomas Powell. Alex would headline his first MMA event as well, and he would not disappoint. He would land a picture-perfect left hook and starch his opponent just 4 minutes into the first round. After this insane knockout, Alex would finish his contract in glory, having 2 great fights with Artem Vakitov, winning one and losing one. He would also retire from kickboxing, being considered to be the best kickboxer in history, or at least one of the best depending on who you talk to. Alex would catch the attention of the UFC mostly due to Alex being one of the few fighters to not only beat Adesanya, but knock him out cold in kickboxing. Alex would make his UFC debut November 6, 2021. His opponent would be Andreas Michailidis. This would be a big test for Alex, and he would not disappoint because in the second round he would land a picture-perfect flying knee, shocking the world, with every MMA fan anticipating what a rematch in MMA would look like with the dominant middleweight champion, Israel Adesanya. But we were still far away from seeing that fight happen. Alex would take on his next challenge in March of 2022. He would be fighting Bruno Silva. This would be a one-sided beatdown that left fans shocked at how clean Alex's striking was, but also how good Bruno's chin was. Alex would fall short of getting a knockout, but still would win by unanimous decision. The next man would be a future champion and fan favorite, Sean Strickland. This was a huge jump up in competition. Many thought Sean would give Alex a run for his money due to his high-level jiu-jitsu, as well as his experience in the sport. But on July 2nd, 2022, it would turn out to be a whole different story, because in just 2 minutes, Alex would land a picture-perfect left hook that flatlined Strickland after a follow-up shot. After getting the clean knockout, the fans would finally see the fight they have all been waiting for, Israel Adesanya for the middleweight belt. And remind you, this is only Alex's 8th MMA fight, and on November 12th, 2022, he would fight for that belt that was wrapped around Israel's waist, with this being the most anticipated fight in both of their careers. And once the ref said fight, it would not disappoint. Both men would land clean shots for 4 rounds, with Israel showcasing his great footwork and great fight IQ, and Alex showcasing his fantastic shot selection and crazy power. It was looking like Israel would get the win by decision, but 2 minutes into the last round, Alex would rock Israel with a clean left hook and land a devastating flurry of punches that would have Israel out on his feet and force the ref to step in to save Israel from taking unnecessary punishment, not only shocking the world by winning the UFC title just 1 year and 6 days after making his UFC debut, but dethroning one of the most dominant middleweight champions we have ever seen. With Alex becoming a superstar overnight and MMA fans questioning where he will go next and if he was already considered one of the best combat sports athletes of all time. Alex would take his time fighting again. He would take the rest of the year of 2022 off to enjoy the fruits of his labor, as well as get in a full training camp. And on April 8, 2023, the inevitable rematch with Israel Adesanya would take place, with this being their 4th time fighting each other. Once again, this fight would live up to all of the hype, with it being reminiscent of their previous fight, with Israel outlanding with more volume and Alex landing the harder shots. That would make Israel more hesitant to fight in the pocket, but it would only go 2 rounds because Alex would land a hard hook that hurt Israel and would send Israel staggering into the cage, but he wasn't nearly as hurt as he led on, because when Alex would go in for the finish, Israel would slip and land a devastating counter right hand that would knock out Alex Pereira, putting an end to the legendary rivalry that transcended into 2 different sports. Many fans wanted another rematch, but Israel wasn't interested, and the UFC noticed how hard it was for Alex to make the 185-pound weight limit and would want to have him go up to light heavyweight as John Jones had left, and it's been a round robin of fighters getting the belt. So the UFC would have Alex Pereira fight the only other man to beat Israel Adesanya before Alex, Jan Blachowicz. And on July 29th, 2023, Alex would fight Jan. This was a close fight that tested both men and showcased just how good Alex's takedown defense is. This fight would go all 3 rounds, and it would be a split decision win for Alex Pereira. With Alex's coach Glover Teixeira losing his belt to Yuri Prohaska and retiring, there was another rivalry brewing, and on November 11th, 2023, Alex would fight Yuri for the light heavyweight belt. And this fight would not disappoint, with Yuri landing hard shots as well as Alex landing his own hard shots. It was evident that someone would get knocked out sooner or later, and 4 minutes into the 2nd round, Alex would drop Yuri and rain brutal hammer fists and elbows that would leave Yuri unconscious. Alex had gotten revenge for his fallen coach and had been one of the few fighters to hold 2 belts in the UFC. Alex had become such a big superstar that he would headline one of the biggest cards in UFC history, UFC 300. His opponent would be former light heavyweight champion Jamal Hill. This fight had an insane amount of hype, with both men having knockout power as well as never putting on a boring performance. And on April 13th, 2024, this fight would commence, and it would turn out to be one-way traffic for Alex Pereira, because just 3 minutes into the fight, Alex would knock out Jamal Hill with a perfect left hook after getting hit with a low blow and telling the ref to keep the fight going. This would go viral with hundreds of edits, turning this fight into an iconic performance for the legend Alex Pereira. Many fans felt like Alex deserved some time off, but Alex is built differently. Just 2 months later, in June, he would have a rematch with Yuri Prohaska, as Yuri had gotten a huge win on the prelims of UFC 300. Once the fight happened, it was more dominance for Alex Pereira, because just 13 seconds into the 2nd round, Alex would land a clean head kick that sent Yuri down to the canvas, and Alex would rain ground and pound shots until the ref stepped in, getting his 2nd title defense stacked on top of his legendary career. And that brings us to this weekend. Alex is fighting an absolute savage in Khalil Roundtree, who is arguably one of the best Muay Thai fighters in MMA. It goes without saying who I think will win this fight. I think Alex will beat Khalil in the 2nd or the 3rd round by knockout, but I think it will be a very fun and a beautiful display of violence at the highest level. Alex Pereira is 6'4" and 37 years old, which means we don't have a lot more time watching this legendary fighter in the octagon, so enjoy it while you can. Alex currently has 11 wins with 2 losses. He has 9 knockout wins and 2 decision wins. He has been submitted 1 time and knocked out 1 time, which means he has an 82% finishing rate and has been finished in all of his losses, so he is the definition of a kill or be killed fighter. Today, we are taking a gander at the life and career of Anthony Fluffy Hernandez. We will be referring to him as Fluffy, as that is how many fans recognize him. Fluffy was born on October 18th, 1993. He was born and raised in Dunnigan, California, where he would go on to graduate from Woodland High School in 2011. He started training in high school, but a young Fluffy was tunnel visioned when it came to sports, so much so that he would get booted off the team due to his very lackluster grades. Despite the poor grades, he would go to college, but would soon drop out so that he could pursue his career in MMA. So without further ado, let's get right into his career. Like and subscribe. Fluffy had quite the long amateur career before going pro. He had a total of 10 fights, going 9-1. So it goes without saying that Fluffy was a highly touted fighter, and he would make his professional debut on September 13th, 2014. He would face off with Trey Williams. Fluffy would walk into this fight nervous but ready, and in no time at all, Fluffy would absolutely demolish Williams, knocking him out just 51 seconds into the first round. After winning his debut with a quick knockout, Fluffy would take on his next fight in March of 2015. His opponent would be Kenny Ento. This would turn out to be yet another quick finish, not by knockout, but by guillotine, just 3 minutes into the first round. Fluffy was on a roll and would not stop anytime soon, so to keep his momentum, he would take on another fight in August of that same year. His opponent would be Preston Snook. Fluffy would keep his first round finishing streak going by sinking in yet another guillotine choke and win the fight in just 90 seconds. Fluffy would take his time to fight again, wanting to further improve his skills. He would take his fourth fight in August of 2016 against Jamoke Hunter. Fluffy would once again get another first round finish with another guillotine choke. Fluffy was beginning to look like he was UFC bound, but he still needed to get more wins behind him. So he would take on his next opponent, Mike Persons, in March of 2017. This would be one of his best finishes to date because in just 3 minutes, he had sunk in a nasty standing guillotine choke and got the submission win. After getting one of the coolest submissions to watch in a cage fight, he would sign to LFA and fight another future top-level UFC fighter, Ailin Brandon Allen. And this would be for the LFA middleweight belt, as well as his first 5-round fight. Unsurprisingly, this would be his hardest fight at the time, and it would be a back and forth war, with Fluffy winning the majority of the exchanges. He would go on to beat Allen by unanimous decision. This would catch the attention of the biggest promotion in the world, the UFC, but they would want him to prove himself on the very popular show Dana White's Contender Series. His opponent would be Jordan Wright. This would be his fastest finish to date because in just 40 seconds, he would get Jordan on the ground and he would batter him into submission, winning by TKO. But Fluffy had done something illegal before the fight. He smoked the devil's lettuce, the green gas, the loud chronic dank ganja, if you will, otherwise known as weed. And this fight would get overturned to a no contest. Fans were outraged at this, not because Fluffy had done something bad, like take steroids or messed with the scale before the fight, but because the chronic is legal in the majority of states, Nevada included. So the UFC would sign him regardless of the controversy. He would make his UFC debut on February 2nd, 2019. His opponent would be Marcus Perez, and he would be on the wrong end of a high-level submission because in the first 60 seconds into the second round, Fluffy would get stuck in an anaconda choke, making this his first loss in his career. This was rough for Fluffy, but he was still extremely confident and wanted to prove to the world that he was one of the top fighters in the UFC. So he would take on his next opponent just a few months later in August. He would face off with the Iron Turtle, Jun Young Park. This was a close fight up until the end of the second round because Fluffy would sink in the submission that made him lose his last fight, the anaconda choke. After getting his first win in the UFC, he would be scheduled to fight another up-and-coming prospect, the Trailblazer, Kevin Holland. This would be a very rough night in the office for Fluffy because in just 39 seconds, he would get kneed in the breadbasket and fall to the ground, and Holland would rain brutal ground and pound until the ref stepped in, giving Fluffy his second loss and his first loss by TKO. Fluffy was gutted. Not only had he lost, but his UFC record was very lackluster, with it being a rough 1 win and 2 losses. So he would take the rest of the year off and fight again in February of 2021 against Rodolfo Vieira. This would turn out to be a great performance for Fluffy because in the second round he would sink in a nasty Armin guillotine choke and get the tap. This would be such a good submission that he would be awarded a $50,000 performance bonus. After the impressive win, on, he would start to have very bad luck with his opponents. He would get his next fight with Pena Soriano cancelled due to Fluffy hurting his hand, so he would sign up to fight Dustin Stoltfus, but this would get cancelled due to Fluffy hurting his knee. So he would sign up to fight Albert Duraev, but Duraev injured his ribs. So he would sign up to fight future champion Dricus du Plessis, but this fight would get cancelled due to Dricus getting rebooked to fight Kelvin Gastelum. After getting 4 fights in a row cancelled for one reason or another, he would get his next fight in April of 2022 against Josh Fremd. This would be a harder fight than expected, but it was still a great showing from Fluffy because he would win by unanimous decision. Not wanting to slow down, he signed to fight Marc-Andre Barillon in September of 2022. This would be yet another fantastic showing from the budding prospect because in the 3rd round he would sink in the arm triangle choke. Fluffy was slowly becoming a fan favorite amongst the hardcore fan base. With the UFC realizing the potential of Fluffy, they would have him fight another prospect, Edmund Shabazian, in May of 2023. This would turn into a great fight that would yet again showcase how good Fluffy really was, because in the 3rd round, Fluffy would get Edmund down and reign in brutal ground and pound until the ref stepped in and stopped the fight. Fluffy had finally gotten a pretty big name on his resume, but he would have another rough stint of cancelled fights, because his fight with Chris Curtis would get cancelled, his fight with Roman Kopylov would get cancelled as well, and his fight with Ikram Aliskerov would get axed as well. But Roman Kopylov would step in for Ikram and fight Fluffy in February of this year. Fluffy would square off with Kopylov. This would be a very interesting fight because Kopylov is a kickboxer with good wrestling defense, and Fluffy is obviously a good wrestler with very good jiu-jitsu. And this time, the wrestler would get the job done, because in the 2nd round, Fluffy would sink in a rear naked choke and get the submission win, derailing the hype train of Kopylov, as well as getting the label of the dark horse of the division. And that brings us to this weekend. Anthony Fluffy Hernandez is set to face off with another fan favorite in Michel Pereira. This is a very exciting fight because Pereira is a very flashy striker that has some good grappling, but he also has knockout power. And Fluffy is a very good grappler that can strike good enough to hang with the top level guys. Before I make my prediction, we will go over Anthony Fluffy Hernandez's stats. He stands at 6 feet tall, his record is 12-2, and he is currently on a 5-fight win streak. He has 2 knockout wins, 1 in the 1st round and 1 in the 3rd round. He has 8 submission wins, with 4 submissions in the 1st round and 3 subs in the 2nd round and 1 in the 3rd. And his other 2 wins would be by decision. His 2 losses have been 1 by TKO and 1 by submission. I think Anthony has what it takes to get the win, but Michel is unpredictable and has a good chance at catching Fluffy with a crazy shot. But if Anthony is defensively aware and plays it safe, he has a great shot at getting a submission in either the 2nd or the 3rd round, which is why I'm picking him to win. But I wouldn't be surprised if the odds are even going into this fight.